This is The Baseline, discussing the hot button topics of the NBA.
Welcome, everybody. You're tuned to The Baseline. Callie Warrenshaw discussing the hot button topics of the NBA. Man, oh man, we are just rolling out the great content. Fresh off of a great interview with Cavaliers head coach J.B. Bickerstaff. Oh, we're like the Roots, baby. You want more? We giving you more. And I can't wait for us to roll out our next guest, who's going to be jumping on board with us to talk extensively about everything going on in the NBA and their upcoming book. Let me go ahead and roll out the red carpet, though, to my right-hand man, www.shawsports.net, Big Kahuna PNC, my man, Mr. Warren Shaw, repping out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Holla back at me, Mr. Shaw. I am shivering in excitement over what we've been doing over the last couple of weeks, man, and it only gets better.
The vibe has definitely been great for us here on the baseline, and we just continue to keep it rolling, as you alluded to, man. Another great banger coming up, talking about a topic that I think a lot of fans are going to have some interest in, whether you're an old school fan, a new school fan, or whatever, just a fan in general. This is something that you'll definitely be able to sink your teeth into. So again, we're keeping this thing rolling here on the baseline, bro. Good shouts to you, man, being an amazing host and all the great intros you give to all these great guests. Again, they love to hear your voice, brother. They love to hear it.
Yeah, man, I feel like I'm like the buffer of podcasting right about now, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? Hey, if you need a great intro, just call on me, man. Get at your boy, Game Face Lee, man. I feel energetic about it. But you know what? In all honesty, I give the credit to our guests, man. I mean, they're just some really great, dynamic people. And I think, as you agree, when we sit here and we throw our Q&As and we have our conversations back and forth, you know, they are exactly as advertised, man. And they give us, you know, great reason for us, you know, to highlight them in the way that they do, not because they're just being on our show, but simply because, you know, they are individuals who are making things happen, who are actually jumping on our platform and speaking to a lot of the things that our listeners want to hear about. And they also like talking shop, man. And what better place to do that in is been doing it on our podcast, right? So as always, I thank you, my partner in crime, because, you know, these people don't be knocking on our doorstep, you know, without your voice being lent to it, man. You're the one that's setting them up, right? So you're the next best thing to Maverick Carter for the Baseline NBA podcast, and we salute you for that, right? So listen, all of the niceties aside, man, we bigging each other up. Let's big up you, the listeners, man, as we bless you with another great show on tap. We have with us a great person, you know, doing big things. He's written for a lot of different outlets, but he has finally released a book on a topic that I think you all are going to definitely enjoy. It's the word dynasty. What is that supposed to mean? How does that relate when we talk about the NBA? And I think this guy really has kind of put his stamp on being a certified logic and novice about what that word is supposed to mean and how we might want to engage and look at it. In a moment, we will have our man Agu Ibanez-Baldor, who has just recently dropped his newest book release, Dynasty, The Rise and Fall of the Greatest Teams in NBA History. And we cannot wait to do a little FaceTime with the Baseline with him. But as always, we got to do our plugs. So be sure to get my man Shaw at Shaw Sports NBA, or get at me at GameFaceLee, the show's Twitter handle at NBA Baseline. Available on all the major platforms. You know where to find us. You know what we're about. You always look for the Baseline NBA podcast. You know, connect, add us to the playlist, allow us to be your go-to resource discussing all of the great topics in the NBA. So, without further ado, let's keep this party rolling, baby. You know how we do. You know how we roll. Let's do a little FaceTime with the Baseline.
It's the questions. It's the questions, boy. It's the questions. It's the questions. Come on. The questions. It's the questions, boy. It's the questions. It's the questions. Yeah. The questions. It's the questions, y'all. It's the questions. It's the questions. Dig it.
Callie Warrenshaw, the Baseline NBA podcast. And with us this week, I'm really excited to be able to have an individual, more so, I guess you can say someone as appointed historian, because he has actually taken the time and the energy to put together a really well-documented book and a perspective of what dynasty should mean as it pertains to the NBA. And those who are basketball purists, who are people that, follow and watch the game, the word dynasty, you're often on shaky ground in your interpretation, the definition, the understanding, and where this all may lead to, because we are so passionate about not just our individual teams that we sometimes don't lend credence to other teams who actually embody what the word dynasty means. And here to help us kind of really dig into that, really break down the essence of it, because he has a really well-written and well-documented book called Dynasty, The Rise and Fall of the Greatest Teams in NBA History. We have Agu Ibanez-Baldor, the author. Thank you for hopping on board with this, Agu.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. I was listening to the JB Bickerstaff episode yesterday, and you guys gave him like an awesome intro for the head coach of the Cleveland Cavaliers, and I was like, man, there's no way they're going to be able to do a good intro for me after doing that. And you guys, so nice, man. That was so nice. I appreciate y'all having me on.
Hey, man, we aim to please, right? But no, we sincerely appreciate you actually taking some time out, not only to plug in your book and to help us really get a understanding for our listeners, but to have a good and honest conversation about what the word dynasty is supposed to truly mean. Because even myself and Shaw, we may have a difference of an opinion about what that word is supposed to mean as it pertains to the NBA. So let's start from there. What made you decide to create this book? And why is the word dynasty, as it's very much highlighted as part of the title of your book, why is it important for us to understand what that terminology means as it pertains to the NBA?
Sure. So basically, for me, writing the book, I mean, everyone knows the greatest teams of all time. You got like the Larry Bird Celtics and the Jordan Bulls and all that stuff. But I just kind of wanted to go in depth into the numbers and see like what common things do they have in their building and like sustaining of success. Not that they've all been built the same way, but I was sure that there were similarities, And I guess in terms of the importance of the definition for the book, the way I defined it was anybody that won 3 titles in a 5-year period, basically ruling a half decade of the NBA. I counted that as a dynasty, and mainly the reason is there's 7 teams that have done it, perfect amount of chapters and stuff like that. But there are teams that didn't do it that aren't as included, or they get bonus chapters. So, I mean, I'm not saying that this is the definition that should be considered as a dynasty. I just figured for the purposes of the book, it felt really clean to do that definition.
Tell us what drew you to the subject matter in itself, if you will. Basketball is such a broad topic, and obviously dynasties and defining that is a very interesting, nuanced part of that overall subset and culture, so to speak. But what brought it to you to this aspect where you wanted to actually write, 200 some pages, on this great topic?
Well, I did an article for lineups about the Thunder after they traded Westbrook and Paul George beginning of this summer, I think, like the last summer, basically titled The Dynasty That Never Was. And that article has actually been edited, and it's in the book as a bonus chapter right now. And I just had a lot of fun, like researching not only like the players on the team and stuff like that, but how the team was created from scratch. I mean, with they drafted KD, Westbrook, and Harden in 3 consecutive years, and the decisions they made to sort of like build their success. So I wanted to do that with teams that kind of actually made it. I mean, I wanted to see the process of Tim Duncan's Spurs being built draft by draft, free agency by free agency, trades by trades, and see like exactly what happened to create that success and then sustain the success, especially in the Spurs case with 22 straight playoff appearances. Could be 23rd. They just took the 9th spot in the West, guys.
So it's interesting, I guess, for me, like how we look at the word dynasty, and I mean, we can even obviously apply it to the true meaning in historical context. And it's hard for us because in the NBA, it is so difficult for teams to go back to not just repeating champions, but even getting back to the NBA finals. And I think the first thing that jumps out at my mind when I think of the word dynasty is what other than winning the championships, what else predicates the dynasty? Is it more because of the organization? Like it's the same owner, the same GM, the same head coach,
Right.
or is it dictated by the player, the personnel that consists of what they were able to accomplish within the period of time as you had laid it out in your book?
Right. I mean, obviously this is a bit of like a cop out, but it's a bit of everything, What I found mostly was the players are super important, and especially like the superstars, but the biggest thing was not only chemistry, but having the same guys around, Like for an example, we could do San Antonio again. I mean, they had Timmy, Manu, and Parker together for what, a decade, all together working together. And typically it takes a front office and coach that is willing to do anything to maintain that. So a front office that doesn't care about spending the money, an owner that doesn't care about spending the money, a head coach who doesn't worry about, a guy that he's had before going through some struggles, letting him work through it. With those sort of things. A super cool example is like the Raptors. I mean, they lost Kawhi Leonard, considered probably at worst the third best player in the NBA, and they have a better record than they did last year. They look as good as they did last year, minus Kawhi. And it's basically because they've got all the same guys. Obviously, they lost Kawhi, and that's a big blow, but they've got the same guys, almost no new additions. Nick Nurse is still one of the best coaches in the NBA. Masai Ujiri is not afraid to pull the trigger on some trades that, are going to help him win a championship. He's done it before. And their owner wants to spend the money. They've been over the tax forever, man. I mean, they were paying DeMar and Kyle Lowry forever. So the Raptors, I think, are a good present-day example of that. They're keeping all the guys that they have to in the same unit, and they have an open mind about where they want to go next.
Shaw, before you jump in real quick, so let me ask you this question. Where do you think the dynasty begins for the Toronto Raptors? Because I guess you can say, in essence, Kyle Lowry was one of the starting blocks, right? And then the formation of DeMar DeRozan. Dwayne Casey was the head coach before they decided to move on from him and allow Nick Nurse to take over. They win the championship, obviously making the big trade and getting Kawhi Leonard. But you can make the argument that the Toronto Raptors had been very much relevant and very much on a dynastic incline prior when LeBron James was still with the Cleveland Cavaliers.
Right. Yeah. So the way that I would put it, people could consider if Kawhi stayed, it would probably be when they traded for Kawhi. That would make the most sense. They had Kyle Lowry already. They had Pascal Siakam already. They had OG Anunoby, Norman Powell, Fred VanVleet, all those dudes, and they traded for Marc Gasol too. I think the dynasty starts when they fire a Coach of the Year candidate, or actually Coach of the Year winner that year, in exchange for Nick Nurse, who blew it out of the water. I mean, an example is the Raptors were just as relevant as the Warriors were with Mark Jackson as the head coach. Great defense, decent offense, a couple of playoff series wins. But I would argue they weren't a dynasty until they fired their Coach of the Year, who had some stuff going on in the locker room too, for Steve Kerr, who opened it up and that sort of thing. Not that the coach is the most important part, but I think the dynasty begins when they have a coach that plays the players exactly how they should be played. Not that Steve Kerr is a better coach than Mark Jackson, although probably some people would argue that. It's just that for the personnel that they had on the Warriors, Steve Kerr was the perfect choice. And for the Raptors, it looks like, despite Dwayne Casey being a great coach and doing a good job in Detroit with a seriously injured roster, he's just the right choice for the guys they have, specifically Pascal Siakam, who did not explode until Nick Nurse came to town.
It's funny how you mirrored, Mark Jackson and Dwayne Casey, because you could make the argument that both of them kind of traveled down that, that solemn road of, the teams that they thought that they could probably see themselves coaching for years on end, coming to some form of an abrupt end. And then the moment that they leave is when the teams decide to, take off in that particular essence. Okay, Shaw, my apologies on that.
Yeah, no worries at all. I mean, I think great conversation, especially for our fans and listeners here. And Agu, I think it's really very nuanced for me in terms of when you look at the dynasty or any type of team chemistry in general. Like, it's the ownership has to be in alignment, general management needs to be in alignment, the players and the talent needs to be in alignment, and then along with the coaches as well too. When you go to take on what you've taken on here, it's just my assumption. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but it most researchers go in with some semblance of a preconceived notion as to what they're going to find. Is there anything that you found in your research that just kind of blew your mind, so to speak, where you didn't I didn't expect to see that when you were conducting the research on these times?
Sure. So when I wrote the book, when I was about halfway through with it, I developed the formula that I use in the book. It's just 8 categories, and you can earn points on the categories. For example, like you get 15 points added to your total score for how many All-Stars you had on your roster that season. Stuff like that. 1 point for every returner from a championship. You add it all up and you divide by 8, and that's sort of like a dynasty score. So I had some preconceived notions for sure when I started running the formulas for each team. And some stuff did come out true. Like I expected the Kobe Shaq Lakers to be a bit lower because it was Kobe and Shaq and a couple of role players that were high, like above decent, I would say, with Robert Ory and Derek Fisher. But beyond that, it was usually dudes that were average to barely above average that did the job. I mean, they won a three-peat, don't get me wrong. But the way that the formula works, it sort of rewards a full team as opposed to 2 awesome players, even though they were worth a lot of points in the formula. And on the other side, I had a preconceived notion that the Warriors would have the highest average dynasty score during their run, just because, I mean, if you have 3 All-NBA players every season, you're going to have a high score every year. But I was right that the 62 or 72-10 Bulls had the highest single season dynasty score out of the teams that we looked at. So, I mean, they say 72-10 is a better ring to it, and it looks like the numbers kind of agree too.
Agu Ibanez-Baldor joining us here on the Baseline NBA podcast. He is the author of Dynasty, The Rise and Fall, the greatest teams in NBA history. You can certainly catch him on Twitter at AguIbanez-Baldor. So, Agu, not veering a little bit off from what we were just discussing here, I'm really curious, as you were putting this book together, and clearly you have a plethora of references and sources. How much of it was predicated on access to writers / maybe historians that have covered some of the dynasty teams that you specifically mention and talk about at length in the book? And how much infighting did you have with those guys as it pertains to what you came up with when you totaled the numbers in your determinants of these teams and where they kind of fall along lines in the totem pole, in the food chain, so to speak, as one of the most dynastic teams? There had to have been some infighting going on.
So yeah, of course. I mean, I'm sure that and I talk about it in the book. I mean, I dropped my Twitter handle a couple times in the book and like, hey, if you have a complaint about this that you're really upset about, why don't you just tweet me something like really mean, So it's just sort of like
it does tell you that they were reading your book then, if it came down to that, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure I'm going to have some people that are upset that the Warriors have such a high dynasty score just because, they're super recent and people that, were around during the Jordan era, which I wasn't. I was born the year he retired, so I didn't get to see a lot of MJ live, at least. But people that grew up in that time, obviously they're going to think that the Bulls were the best team of all time and that the Warriors wouldn't be able to, get close to them, So I'm sure people are going to be mad about that. And I had some infighting with that too. And at the end of the book, I run the formula for every single team in the NBA to see who's closest to a dynasty right now. Mm-hmm. And number 1 was the Bucks. And yeah, I'm from Milwaukee. And yeah, it doesn't look awesome. And I'd say that in the book as well. I'm like, yeah, it might seem like homerism, but these are why the numbers worked out the way they are. So just yell at somebody else. I'm not hearing it, So, yeah.
Hey, you
got to
keep it real with them.
I just don't want to be biased.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to keep it real with them.
I mean, the Bucks had a massive score, and basically what I did was, because there wasn't an MVP or All NBA teams announced yet, which are pretty important for the formula numbers, I just came up with my own. and I picked 2 winners for each award to sort of cover my bases, you know? So I put down Budenholzer as the second winner for the Coach of the Year behind Nick Nurse, I think. And I was like, listen, Budenholzer's probably not going to win Coach of the Year, even though he kind of just did. He's like, you're probably not going to win. But even if you take those points away from the Bucks and that average, they still have the number 1 score. So, I mean, you know, there's no reason to actually be mad about this. And I mean, just the Lakers stuff. I take some shots at the Lakers stuff just because it's fun. You know, I just like, it's
You're
like at the beginning of the book,
yeah,
it's more so like,
yeah, exactly.
if you're a LeBron,
I'm the holder of the pen.
Exactly. I'm not being mean or anything. I'm just saying, like, you know, if you're a LeBron fan or a Laker fan or a fan of the other 29 teams, which ESPN tells me they don't exist, but maybe they do, you know, you're gonna like the book. But it's all fun. I don't mean anything mean-spirited. It's just, you know, I didn't want to write a dissertation about the greatest teams in NBA history. I wanted to be a little sarcastic, have my own humor in there, and then, you know, tell some stories, which I think we pulled off, you know?
So this is a labor of love. You know, again, you alluded to a little bit a while ago, but again, how long in the making, if you will, again, start to finish this process? You know, you said it iterated from an article on lineups, but start to finish, how long does the whole thing take you?
August to August, man. Full year.
Nice. Nothing
So
wrong with that.
started with some research. Writing was finished about in the winter, actually. Finalized the writing. Then we went through some heavy editing with like professional editors, obviously, cover design and marketing. You know, I did a lot of self-marketing for the book. So even after the writing was finished, which was, you know, a big bulk of the work, I was still busy pretty much all the time with book stuff up until now, you know. And even now I'm still doing, you know, promo stuff and reaching out to people and stuff like that. So I'd say just about a year.
Great. And Agu, I think you've captured, even here on the show in a short time, I think the tenor of the book, if you will. There's definitely some tongue-in-cheek stuff, some sarcasm in there, your own wit and humor, and that's throughout, and that's sprinkled throughout. And I think that's what can make it definitely attractive, you know, to readers, especially looking for a different take, you know, on basketball. But taking things to a kind of post time or past time to a current time now, in a very, very serious note, there's a part in this book where you talk about the race relations and the Boston Celtics, and we're kind of in a very, very similar situation right now in the world. Talk a little bit about the inclusion of that part of the book, you know, with Boston being, by a lot of accounts, you know, still a very, very racist city and town.
Right. Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I thought it was important to put that in there, just like, hey, here's proof that politics didn't enter sports with Kaepernick kneeling. It's always been political and nobody ever wants to talk about it. I mean, everyone always talks about like that. Oh, they're trying to make our sports political now. I'm not going to be a fan. That's fine. This is fine.
Mm-hmm.
You know? So I just wanted to include that, you know, like race, sports, and politics have been linked since the beginning. There's never been, you know, a resurgence or anything. And I thought it was important to mention. I mean, it's a big thing. Bill Russell was one of like the biggest civil rights activists in sports history. We should talk about that, you know? Right. And I thought it was important to talk about that. He was a massive member of the civil rights movement, and his coach, Red Auerbach, wasn't as much of like a campaigner, but he was totally cool with it, despite being, you know, in Boston, where the fans certainly didn't like it. Bill Russell himself wasn't like a massive fan of Boston. When he had his retirement jersey, he requested just friends and family. He didn't want to have, you know, a massive stadium of Boston fans there for that. And I don't know. It's just, I mean, we talk about Bill Russell and the Celtics, like the best team, one of the best teams of all time. And Bill Russell is one of the 10 top, 12 at worst players of all time. Mm-hmm. And we don't talk about how they never sold out arenas. You know, I don't think they ever sold out in Boston. They sent out a flyer, a survey to Boston residents, asking them what could they do, you know, to get fans into the building, make some more money. And almost all the responses were just like less black players, you know. So I think it's just important to talk about. One of the best teams in history wasn't appreciated by its own city for like the entirety of its, I mean, not the entire city. I don't mean to indict Boston as this, you know, evil city. It's not that. But at the time, you know, a majority of people in Boston did not go to the games, and that was the primary reason. I just felt it was important to talk about that because it happened. And like, I don't want to just brush over that, you know?
You can't brush over it. And listen, Shaw and myself, ironically enough, we're kids that were born in New York, but we're Boston Celtics fans, right? And it's difficult because you would say, well, why aren't you naturally just a New York Knicks fan? Or why aren't you naturally like a New Jersey Nets fan? You're a Brooklyn Nets fan and stuff. And it's because we weren't concerned about, per se, the city and what was encompassing the city. We hadn't lived there. What we were concerned with, the players that were playing the game of basketball, and we enjoyed what they were doing on the basketball court. And I guess to bring this full circle to the point of your book, which I found pretty resounding, and I appreciate that you actually, elevated this so that it is important to take into consideration as factors when we think about dynasties and stuff. These guys are playing under extraordinary circumstances. They're playing in circumstances where very easily they could have said, I don't want to play here anymore. And we could be talking about a completely different situation about what kind of dynasty the Boston Celtics look like and reflect. And then you fast forward 40, 50 years, and you take the Lakers, who have Shaq and Kobe, and we're having a discussion about if these guys could just get along for half a season, how many titles they potentially could have won beyond that point. And then you talk about, like, if you fast forward now, we talk about how the CBA has completely changed the dynamic about how it's difficult just to keep superstars to want to stay in small marketplaces to help win titles for those small cities and stuff. So it's remarkable how where you just have one little section in your book, it elevates a whole other context about the criteria that we look at and the way that we focus on why these teams should be mentioned and discussed in the light that they're being discussed. Because in this modern day, there would be no guarantee that we'd be having the kind of, dynastic runs that Bill Russell would have had, or the dynastic runs that Magic Johnson had, or that Larry Bird and those guys have had. It would be a completely different climate of the NBA.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. It's interesting to think about it. I mean, those teams back in the day, there's no way that Scottie Pippen stays with Michael Jordan's entire career today, right?
No way.
He gets traded after MJ is gone, and he has some great seasons after that. Let's not forget that. But there's no way, he's not CJ McCollum. McCollum's happy to stay with Damian Lillard for next couple of years. At least it seems like it. And they're a great duo, but I think Scottie would have asked out after championship 2, if not, or 3, if not 2,
And the climate of how great teams are built and how championship matters in its context, I think is what allows Pippen to say, all right, I'll take it one more time. I'll take this whole little nonsense going on one more time. What was your thoughts about The Last Dance? I know you had mentioned earlier you weren't around during the era of Jordan in his heyday, but you obviously followed this. What were your thoughts about what you saw from Jordan in the way that he was in The Last Dance?
Man, first and foremost, when I started this, I made a point, especially when quarantine started, it was easier to watch at least one full game because they're all on YouTube of each team. So I've watched 3 or 4 full-on MJ games now, which is nowhere near what people growing up watching MJ watch. But I feel like I watched a little bit. But The Last Dance, I loved it, man. I really did. It's full-on Jordan propaganda. Don't get me wrong. There's some revisionist history there that he wouldn't want us to talk about, even though all we talk about is that. But I didn't really consider it like a sports documentary in the sense of this is what happened and this is why it happened, because that's not really what it is. Jordan kind of maneuvers a few things here and there, whether it's him or the producers not wanting to piss him off. They maneuver a couple things. The pizza story doesn't seem super awesome, but
it was good fodder for ESPN, though.
Yeah, it was. But,
I found it nice how Papa John's, how Shaq and Papa John's were running right up on that. He's like, that's why the pizza man is so important, right?
But I found it a super cool psychoanalyst of one of the greatest players we've ever had. We saw Jordan open up probably the most we've ever. He didn't do interviews that he was talking about super serious stuff all the time, like when he was playing as much. Obviously, he had press conferences where he did stuff, but I mean, he fully opens up in this documentary. I mean, you guys tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, is this like the most vulnerable we've seen Jordan on camera?
Yeah, I don't even. I thought the title, "Last Dance," was a
Yeah.
great title, and it spoke more to the mantra of how I remember Phil Jackson in his essence. But I tend to agree with you in a sense that this felt like a psychoanalytical look into the mind, of a maniacal uh, player of greatness.
Yeah,
Like
borderline
that's what this.
psychopathic.
Yeah, I don't know if it was so much about the dynasty. They tried,
Right.
but this was more about Jordan and how he was relentless in being
Right.
in his thirst of greatness, and there's nothing wrong
Right.
with that. I just was saying I
No,
would
it's
have been
not.
nice if they'd have just kind of laid that out in the beginning, because then that really, I think, would have lent to people's understanding about why we should never
Right.
just hold him as such a high. Like, he is a great person. Sean, you can speak to this, as I'm giving this thought. He is a great person, but even within his greatness, there's a little bit of crazy in him, and there's a little bit of
Yeah.
a-hole in him, and there's a little, there's all of these little things, and maybe that all adds up to being great, but that is not something that you can always guarantee replicated means that people are going to
Right.
be destined to do great things either.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the thing with him is like I mean, we saw him from the beginning. This like super humble kid from North Carolina with awesome parents that like really, showed him the right path of how to grow up. And then we saw him turn into this like kind of egomaniac, a little bit of, crazy intensity and making a lot of money. How could you make over $1 billion in your life from that, humble beginnings and not completely change as a person, Um, the way I see it, we've seen people as humble as him make the money that he has and go off a lot deeper ends than him. I mean, he's kind of calm as it goes for guys that made $1 billion. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, he stays
Yeah.
to himself. I think that's something that, I mean, he could have been Kanye really easily. Nothing against him, but Kanye is really, Kanye went a little crazy because of all that fame and money, and I hope he's doing well. I know he's going through some episodes
Went?
right now. hope
I
he's
don't.
doing well.
Went? Still
Well,
going.
you know
He's
what I'm
the
saying.
he's the
I don't know.
Energizer Bunny right now, man.
I got him muted on Twitter, man. I don't know when the episodes happen anymore.
I think great points by both of you, and it's like, it's funny because when on our show, I'm usually the easier of the two and more diplomatic per se. So when Cal
Sure.
called MJ a little bit of an a-hole, I think we can full blown know that MJ was an asshole. Like, no little about it. He was complete, and he basked in being that
Yeah.
that type of dude, if you will. And
Poor Steve Burrell, man.
for real, it brings me to, maybe it's not something like directly related to the book per se, but it would be adjacent, because in your estimation, and again, obviously you weren't around for everything, and hell, you
Right.
weren't even around for everything as well too. But what do you think is the most likable dynasty? Because Jordan had that a-hole mentality, but he's still the most one of the most,
Sure.
not the most popular athlete of all time.
Right.
Definitely
Right.
of our generations. When it comes to that, people liked Curry, but now people have started to turn on him a little bit. They're not as enamored, especially with the KD thing joining that team. Which of the dynasties that you've covered do you feel like was probably the most likable?
So the most beloved is for sure the Bulls, just because I mean they were a global icon. I mean, if you were on the Bulls during those years, you had rock star level fame. I don't think we've had that in sports, let alone basketball, since the Bulls. So in terms of a beloved franchise, I have to say the Bulls, just because I mean they were loved worldwide, not just in China where they're like the second biggest NBA market. I mean, worldwide they went, there were crowds. But I think most likable, honestly, almost every dynasty becomes villains at some point. After Kobe and Shaq's first or second one, especially when they signed Gary Payton and Karl Malone, they were kind of the villains of the league. As soon as the Warriors signed Kevin Durant, everybody but the Warriors hated them. I mean, I did too. I mean, I wanted to see the trilogy between them and the Cavs without Kevin Durant. But listen, if you're the Warriors, you sign Kevin Durant every time. I'm not saying you don't. So I feel like every time people dislike him. Besides the Spurs. I don't think anyone can really say, unless you're a Laker or a Suns fan. I can't say I know a lot of people that just despise the Spurs. You know, they're quiet, they're quote unquote boring, but also Tim Duncan keeps to himself. Super nice guy. Manu Ginobili is the greatest Argentinian player of all time, and that's where my mom was born and raised. You know, I like that team. And I mean, they got Tony Parker, who himself, when he was famous, was not a very likable person, but he had a likable game. And we got Popovich, who's like the most outspoken coach in professional sports in terms of social issues and everything like that. And
The most
he hires
outspoken,
Becky Hammond.
unspoken coach. He
Yeah,
doesn't say
exactly.
nothing. He just looks, and it already says
No,
enough.
I know.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. So I mean, I just think you watch that team, there's 2 or 3 things that you would like about them, and I believe that. I mean, in terms of likability, I think they've got it. I think they've got them beat.
I will say something to add to your point about the San Antonio Spurs. As mundane as they were the blueprint for what I know I've spoken about this with Shaw even well before we even started doing our podcast. They were the blueprint for what I wished a lot of teams had shown, was that yes, you didn't have to go out and have to win championships immediately, but at least build a resume of successfully being above 500, successfully being one of the top 3 teams, not just in your division, but maybe even a top 4 or 5 team in the conference.
In the league.
And you keep doing it long enough, you will eventually catapult yourself to being the top team, to winning a couple of championships. Right. It just winds up being that way. So I wish that so much for the Houston Rockets a couple of times post the Elijah 1 years. I'd wish that for the Memphis Grizzlies when they had, the grit and grind guys and stuff like that.
Those guys are fun.
Yeah. So there were teams that had opportunities. They had the Minnesota Timberwolves. I don't know how many times that we've seen them that, post the Garnett and post Latrell Sprewell. If they had just emphasized a little bit more on the consistency of winning and allowing that to take its true natural course, we could be talking about those teams as being possible dynasties and really upsetting the apple cart for teams like the Lakers and, maybe even teams like the Pistons and, things of that nature. It's just amazing to me how ownership and management are quick to pull the trigger because they want to be like the team that won like the previous year, and they don't look at what their team has been able to amass over the last couple of years.
Right. I mean, the fact of the matter is there's pretty much only one, I would say, franchise in league history that could ever go 0 to 60 from like a lottery team to actually acquiring players to be a contender. That's the Lakers, No one else can do that. No one else can just be a bad team and be like, hey, you should come play for us. The Knicks have definitely tried it. It hasn't worked,
They're still trying.
But then you look at a team like the Nets who had like 3 straight seasons. They're still trying, and they still will try, But like with the Nets who had like 3 straight seasons of decent 500 play, a bunch of cap space, a great coach who they fired, and a good front office. And what do they get? They get Kyrie and Kevin Durant. Who knows if it's going to work out? I hope it does. I like those 2 dudes individually. And I think they get like a lot of crap for stuff they've said or done that they don't super deserve. Kyrie especially, but they got 2 objectively superstars to go to their team because they did that. And Brooklyn's a nobody franchise, I like their franchise. I think Brooklyn's a really cool place for a city or a really cool place for a sports team. But they're the Clippers. They're a nobody franchise, but they did the right things, and now they've got a real team. I mean, we can talk about the Clippers, too. They did the same thing. 3-4 seasons of 500 winning, a good coach, a good front office, and they get Paul George and Kawhi Leonard and Marcus Morris.
So let's touch on that aspect a little bit, and even going back to the Spurs a little bit as well, too. With San Antonio, their dynasty is predicated on a lot of luck. Had David Robinson not gotten hurt, they are not in the position to draft, get a lottery pick, and end up number 1 and getting Tim Duncan, right?
Right.
Golden State did a great job throughout the multiple years in the draft, and then being able to keep that team and organization together. But part of that, somewhat too, like you get Draymond where you get him, and you kind of get lucky that he turns into the player that he turns into. Just I
Yeah.
know there's no rubric for it, so to speak, but can you just talk a little bit about your estimation, the luck factor in some of these dynasties and their sustainability overall?
So I think the luck factor is like a two-part or a two-pronged thing. Yeah, it's lucky that the the Warriors got KD. It's lucky that the Spurs got the number one pick and it turned out to be one of the best power forwards in league history. But at the same time, the Pistons were lucky with the number two pick and they took Darko Milicic. The 76ers got lucky with their first pick and they took Markelle Fultz, who could still be a good player. He had a great season in Orlando and I hope he does well, but they traded him for nothing, you know?
Mhm.
I mean, if they draft Jason Tatum instead, they've probably I don't want to say win a championship, but they've made the conference finals twice by now if they have Jason Tatum.
That's a good point. I was gonna say, the drafting of Markelle Fultz, all it's done is just really add more to the fodder about how people hated the process and what the Philadelphia 76ers did to even form the team that they have, and that's part of the reason why I think the clock is ticking with this basketball team. Because
it is.
when you go out and you kind of prop yourself up on how you think you've, like, in quote unquote, cracked the Da Vinci Code of building a successful basketball team, and the best that your team is giving you is just semifinal appearances. I think if you're in Memphis, you're happy about that. I think if you're in Charlotte, you're happy about that. If you're New Orleans, you're ecstatic about that. But if you're in Philadelphia, right, when you're a part of the original, coming from an original ABA type era, that doesn't fly. Like, that means that you're not doing it well enough. Right. And I think that's where,
especially when you have the players you have.
Exactly, the caliber of players that you have, and that's the reason why I feel like they put themselves on their own clock. Like, even if the intent is that the circumstances fell as they were, and as Shaw said, when you have that luck factor that you're being given all of this access that other teams are clamoring for. The Knicks would be clamoring right now to have access to the ability to even pick some of the players, and they'll probably still get it wrong. But nevertheless, they want to at least be able to say that they had a fair shake in this. The fact that the Sixers have had this, that to me just accelerates the clock on them. It just simply does.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's probably going to end this offseason. Simmons has that injury now. I read a little article explaining the injury because it's a bit weird, but a lot of dudes get over it in like 11 days, but he needs to find out if there's damage, and if they do a scope on his knee, he's out for the rest of the season. So he's trying to find opinions from people that don't require him getting a scope. But if he plays, he doesn't play, they get a first-round exit, one of three things is going to happen. Trade Joel, trade Ben Simmons, or Brett Brown. And I love Brett Brown, man. I just don't think this is the team for him. And honestly, I don't know if there's a coach in the NBA that could make Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid work unless you trade for like three of the best shooters in the league, which they just can't do right now. You just got to split them up. Let them figure it out. I also don't know which one to keep, though. I really
don't. That's for another book.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, you may end up writing something about them, like OKC, the dynasty that never was, and what that was so close, in general, because of the overall talent pool, so to speak. And I wanted to touch on that here for kind of one of my final questions here, Agu, is so with what you alluded to a little bit earlier ago with the dynasty scores for current teams and kind of where they be, Milwaukee coming out number one. It is interesting. Of that top five, Miami is in there, but Miami is the only team without a true superstar. Jimmy Butler is a star. He's an all-star.
Yes.
Bam Adebayo is a star. And I mean, you can argue the point about the Celtics as well, too. I think most people think Tatum is going to ascend to superstar level. So in that aspect,
I agree.
But talk about that a little bit in terms of not having that elite level, like superstar, almost like with the Pistons with Rip Hamilton and Chauncey Billups and Rasheed Wallace, just very, very good players who just messed at the right time.
Yeah.
How does that kind of factor into the dynasty aspect?
Right. So with Miami, especially not having a superstar, I mean, it's cool that you picked out the Pistons because Miami's kind of like a post Warriors Pistons team in terms of they got a lot of defense, but they also got a lot of shooters, you know? And for them, I think it's just they play harder than anyone in the league. I wouldn't give that title to anyone else. They play great defense. They've got guys with incredible confidence. Tyler Hero out of Wisconsin. Originally, they went to Kentucky. I mean, the confidence on that kid to shoot the shots that he takes is kind of ridiculous. They got Goran Dragic, who's got kind of a little bit of old man swag to him now. Like he's kind of pissed off and he's just kind of playing with that. I really like it. And then you got Bam Adebayo, man. He's averaging what 16, 10, and 5 for his center. He's the perfect center to have in the small ball era. You can't play him off the court, and you can't really bully ball him with guys that aren't, I don't know, Joel Embiid, you know? I think for them, they have the beginnings of it. So they're not a dynasty. They're not going to be a dynasty in their current state. They could win 1 to 2 titles like the Pistons did with those sort of rosters, but they won't be a dynasty. But I think what they have right now is a winning culture, a lot of cheap contracts, and some tradable stuff to get a third star to join that team. Or if you want to trade one of your 2 stars to get an even bigger star, but that's a different story. I think they have what it takes to get another third star, which was almost Danilo Gallinari at the trade deadline, who would have been amazing for that team. They just couldn't agree on an extension after that. And I don't know if Iguodala is washed or not. I have to watch a little bit more of it, but he hasn't looked super great so far. I think they have the pieces to trade for a third guy, and then you can match 3 stars with some great chemistry, a great coach, a great front office, and some role players that have the confidence of stars, frankly. You know, so I guess the dynasty score is more about like what they could accomplish as opposed to what they're going to
Agu, a
accomplish.
couple questions on my side before we let you get up out of here, man. So, the first question I have is really more pertaining to what we're just talking about here in the NBA restart. If LeBron James wins an NBA championship, albeit in this COVID championship, right? If he
Mm-hmm.
wins it, are we talking about a possible Lakers dynasty? You know, because given the fact that he is only there right now, based on the current contractual climate, to be only there
Right.
for right for 2-3 years essentially, right? So if he wins
Right.
a championship now, and let's just say he happens to try and do it again come next year, are we talking
Right.
about that in essence being something dynastic? Or, if
Right.
LeBron only wins the 1 championship in this short duration and he decides that he wants to go off to greener pastures, will that eliminate what he's
Right.
done for the Lakers in this time frame from anything that we speak of from your criteria of what's considered dynastic?
I think the only way that LeBron leaves, which obviously no one's been right about LeBron's motivations for leaving places before, so I'm not trying to pretend that I know these things, but I personally believe that the only way LeBron leaves is that in 3 years they haven't won a title, and his son is drafted by a decent team. Doesn't have to be good, but they got to be decent. I think that's the only way he leaves is to go play with him.
He pulls a Griffey.
Yes. I think honestly, I think it certainly could be a dynasty. I think they could three-peat. I don't think it's super likely. But I think at the beginning of the season, LeBron said he was giving up the reins to Anthony Davis, who at this point of his career is probably a more suitable number 1 option than a 35-year-old LeBron, despite LeBron being damn near the MVP again. And he hasn't done it. And it's really hurt them in the bubble game so far. I mean, and it's really hurting LeBron too. He's got that groin injury now. He's over doing himself, and AD's suffering too. What did he have? Like 8 points last game? He really needs to fully give it to AD, and Frank Vogel needs to build a game plan around Anthony Davis. Let LeBron be the second guy. I mean, it definitely could be a dynasty. LeBron's 35. The Magic Kareem dynasty ended what Kareem was 40 in their last title, I think,
Right.
like some super old age. So if Kareem can do it, I think LeBron, who's always been the best person in sports of taking care of their body, I certainly think he can be healthy and good for that amount of time. It's going to depend on the other guys they got around them, though. I don't know if the Dion JR combo is gonna cut it. I really don't. I love those guys though. When they're on the court at the same time, I know something beautiful is gonna happen. Whether it's beautifully good or beautifully bad, I know it's gonna happen, and it's always great, man.
Well,
Also,
I just think it's
good on
remarkable
Dion
that
Waiters.
I have to give Dion his props, man. I really thought that
Yeah.
with this amount of time of him being off the court, all of the antics, that I just didn't think he was basketball ready to go out there. But,
Right.
you know, he has contributed for the Lakers so far in this bubble. And he really, more than anything, I think he's earned the trust of Vogel to give him all of the extended minutes prior to the playoffs as necessary, because I really think that he feels like he's going to need him for them to really try and make this run.
Dion probably deserves the criticism he gets for like his selfishness and like hard-headedness, especially because it's not like he was ever an established enough star in this league to have that attitude. But I think he got way too much criticism for like the weed gummy thing. You're in Miami, you're on a flight, take a gummy, why not? You know, he had a bad reaction to it. It happens sometimes. But I mean, it's legal in half the states. Matt Barnes admitted that he was high for nearly every single game he played in the NBA.
And no
So we
one
stopped
can't tell me
pretending like
Sam
weed was
Perkins
like
wasn't
the-
high after those games he played in Indiana.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and Dion's being smart about it. He's taking gummies. He's not smoking and putting smoke into his lungs. You know, I honestly, let's stop pretending like it's some evil thing he did. He just took a gummy and it went bad. You know, it just so happened that he was already on bad terms with the Heat at that time. You know,
Well, so
but now he's doing the thing, man.
Yeah. So, final question for you here, and it goes all the way back here to the book. We want to kind of cap it really with the essence of the book. For anybody and our listeners and people in general, if you can just summarize, what is it that you really want people to extrapolate? What do you want them to take away from reading your book? We've went through a litany of topics with you today. But I know in essence, it's really to pique people's interest about where your mind was at in creating this. But what is it that you want people to get out of this when they read this book, and what you want them to feel after closing that final page?
I guess if at any point of the book they read a sentence and they go like, "Oh shit, he's totally right." That's a success for me in the book. Honestly, I just want someone to be like, "Oh yeah, he definitely knows what he's talking about," and stuff like that. And like, if you have fun reading it, that's also like a big like success thing for me. Like, I don't want you to be bored reading this book. I want you to have fun reading it. In terms of learning stuff about the NBA, it's all in there, baby. Like, there's everything you could hope to learn about the teams that are in there. And if you learn about them, that's great. But fact of the matter is, I hope that people read it and are like, this guy, he has an idea about what he's doing. Whether he's right or wrong, he's got an idea about it. And maybe he's funny. Who knows?
He is the author, the mastermind, the wordsmith for the new released book, Dynasty, The Rise and Fall of the Greatest Teams in NBA History. You can pick up a copy on Amazon. Just put in Dynasty and the author, Agu Ibanez-Baldor, and it'll pop up available on Kindle, also available on paperback. And hey, he is a welcome person to discuss these matters with on his Twitter handle. So be sure to catch him on Twitter at Agu Ibanez-Baldor. All is
Please yell at me.
And he's asking. He wants you to yell at him. You know what I'm saying? Don't sugarcoat. That's not what authors. Authors don't like the sugarcoat. At Agu Ibanez-Baldor. Agu, we really appreciate you jumping on board, man. Has so much fun. Hopefully this won't be the last time that we bring you on board, man. We definitely want to talk shop with you again, but definitely congratulations as always. Anyone who's be able to create a book as such as yours. We want this to be successful, and we really, really wish you the best of luck as well too. But hopefully it won't be the last time you get on board with this, brother.
Super appreciate it, y'all. Kindle's $1 for a month, guys. Go check it out. Super cheap. Make sure to baseline 5 stars, man. You know I've already done it. They deserve it. Give them some of that. And yeah, I really hope this isn't the last time I'm on here too. I had a lot of fun with you guys. So appreciate y'all having me on.
are about that life when it comes to basketball, right? Like, I just find it amazing, man. You know, you can find people from wherever and all over, and they present themselves in such a way that it makes it seem like, you know, they're from your neighborhood. They learned about the game the same way you learned about the game. It's just it's crazy how the game is, you know, where the game is taking us, and the people that we've come across. And this conversation, this sit down conversation that we've had with Agu was just really, you know, again, it just highlights so much of what the game brings to people, and how much thought it you know, it exudes out of people, and the perspectives that are shared from it. Whether you agree or don't agree, it opens up good dialogue, and to me, that's what we got today in having Agu jump on board to talk about not just his book but his perspective and thoughts about the NBA.
I think for me, really, it's taking that level of conversation as you alluded to, like you said, that next level. A lot of times you get into the great debates of Jordan versus Kobe versus MJ, I mean versus LeBron rather, versus whoever, right? Like it's always like which player is better, and then very rarely do you get the which team is better. But even more rarely do you get which dynasty, you know, was better. And this isn't even necessarily about measuring which one is better or worse or per se. It's just paying homage to the fact of how they were built. And to me, that's the most important part of the conversation. There's more than kind of one way to skin a cat, if you will. And he goes through trying to finding the nuanced ways of where there are similarities and where there are differences for each of the dynasties that have been formed over the course of the NBA's existence, so to speak. And I think it's just a great conversation to have in general. It broadens, as you alluded to, the ability to honor multiple eras of the league and not just be kind of stuck into where we're at right now, or even more recency bias because you've seen The Last Dance. You compare the Chicago Bulls to the most recent Golden State Warriors. There's stuff about the Showtime Lakers. There's stuff about, you know, the Bill Russell Celtics, and obviously the Tim Duncan Spurs, all of those guys and all of those teams. And this is, again, just amazing conversation that I think elevates the basketball mind, if you will. And I think that's what we love to do here on the Baseline, is continue to bring evidence to the sport itself, and not just about the X's and O's, or not just about the highlights and dunks. We like to have, you know, meaningful conversations about basketball at all costs.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, just to add one more point to that, is what I can appreciate too is that you're not just looking at numbers, and you're not just looking at the players' jerseys, and you're just not looking at the analytics. You're also looking at the environment. You're looking in the era of where and how the game was being played. And that always has to be taken into consideration. You can't really separate those things, and they're not always mutually exclusive. And I think the fact that he found a way to incorporate that so that people can really be idealistic, right, and realistic about what the expectations are when we make these comparisons about these dynasties, so that this is not just being left to the idea that, you know, this dynasty would never have been able to compete in this era of basketball, vice versa in the third. But what we're also measuring is under the circumstances, you know, what could have been, what should have been, what is happening. These are things that can vastly affect whether or not we're still talking about a dynasty, or whether or not they're going to wind up being discussed in another version of this book that Agu had put together. And to me, that's what it speaks to, is that he is mindful of those elements as he's just creating it, because it's not just about creating hype and you know, paparazzi talk. It's really about opening up a dialogue and being able to pay homage to your point, but also lending an open eye to what we're seeing and what is trending about how dynasties are being built and maybe being built in the future. And I think that is always a good thing. And you don't have to be an NBA purist to recognize that. If you're somebody that just really wants to understand how dynasties are built in a sports forum, this is a good book to start with as well too. And I guarantee you it'll open up your eyes in a historical context about some of the things that we tend to leave out when we recognize some of the greatest teams that were ever formed and how long they lasted in the game of basketball.
Yeah, well said. And shouts to Agu for his diligence and wanting to pursue this topic. He admits that it comes out of the ideation of one single article that has now sparked, a 200-page book, if you will. And I think it's definitely great reading. For me, it's written a little bit like, almost like you're reading something on a website in terms of like the journalistic aspect of it, and that's not a bad thing, because I think he has that levity in there, that sarcasm in there, that wit in there that you don't often find in actual books and paperbacks. You know what I mean? They're typically reserved for something that you maybe read online on a sports website, but he found a great way to kind of find the way to balance all of that and give you the hard data and facts. It's very well researched, has references the whole nine, but again, allowing his personality to show throughout his writing too. And I think it will be a good read for a lot of basketball enthusiasts out there.
Absolutely. And so we encourage you guys, when you have a chance, go to Amazon, just put in Dynasty and the author's name, Agu Ibanez-Baldor, and you'll see the title, Dynasty, The Rise and Fall of the Greatest Teams in NBA History. And again, as always, we enjoy your comments, your thoughts, your perspective. And as much as to what Agu had said earlier on, he would enjoy any comments, thoughts, and don't be quiet. He doesn't want mouse comments. He wants loud, boisterous comments, whether you love him or hate him, right? He wants it to be heard. He very much reminds me of, I don't know, he kind of has that Ric Flair, you know what I'm saying, in the air kind of mentality about, where you may see him. But that's encouraging as well, too. So be sure to tweet at him at Agu Ibanez-Baldor, his whole name, as one, AguIbanez-Baldor. Once again, we appreciate you and yours for hopping on board with us and spending a little FaceTime with the Baseline. Cal Lee, Warren Shaw, we appreciate you guys. You know we do. We'll catch up with you next time.